Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out today for this incredibly important topic. Our panel today is student safety or privacy. Why not both? And I have here an incredibly authoritative, impressive, and awesome panel who can speak to various perspectives on this issue. So I'll start by letting them introduce themselves before I give a little bit of an overview. So Michael, starting with you.
Oh, the pressure. Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Michael Hawes. I'm Director of Student Privacy at the U.S. Department of Education. I head our Student Privacy Policy Office, which is our newly rebranded Office for Student Privacy. It combined the functions of our former Family Policy Compliance Office, which you may be familiar with. It did FERPA investigations and enforcement actions, and the Student Privacy Policy and Assistance Division, which did policy development on student privacy and operated our Privacy Technical Assistance Center, PTAC, which I'll be talking more about later. So that's that.
Good morning. My name is Chad Marlow. I'm a Senior Advocacy and Policy Counsel at the ACLU. The focus of my work is principally on surveillance, privacy, and technology issues. That obviously bleeds over quite a bit into student privacy, and I actually have a ever-expanding portfolio of just student issues in general.
And I'm Bryan Westerman. I'm with Denver Public Schools. I work in the Department of Technology, and I am the Student Data Privacy Officer for the district. So we're responsible for creating a lot of the programs that our district uses in compliance with both state and federal law.
And now to come back to me, I am Amelia Vance, the Director of Education Privacy at the Future of Privacy Forum, which is a nonprofit organization that works on all things consumer privacy, and as the title indicates, I run our education privacy project. So just to sort of kick us off and give a bit of a framework of why this issue is not only so important, but so timely, I want to talk a little bit about what's been happening across the country when it comes to safety issues that may raise privacy concerns. So we had the Florida governor sign a major school safety legislation last March, I believe it was, March or April. And the bill contained two interesting provisions that implicated privacy. One is that it required the creation of a database of social media information combined with social services and law enforcement data to identify threats. When a reporter actually went back to the sponsor of that particular amendment to the legislation, the sponsor said, well, people just report social media posts. It'll go in here, not realizing that the technology existed to proactively scan social media, and the fact that this database would include everything from the 11-year-old's post on Instagram to a 16-year-old's tweet. There are no restrictions on how long the information is kept, and fairly limited data governance procedures in the law itself. Another aspect of the law that raised some privacy concerns over the past year is that it required schools to inquire about student past mental health referrals. There's no guidance that's been given on this particular point, and people are confused about how to implement it. You have one district that proactively put this question in their registration form for the school, and they got an incredible amount of, as you can imagine, of pushback from parents and others who wanted to know why they were doing this, and wasn't this discriminatory towards students with past mental health referrals. We also had the federal report on school safety that came out. The commission met for about a year, heard testimony from several folks, and several school safety and privacy issues were mentioned in there, from discussing FERPA's health and safety exception, which Michael will discuss a little later, as well as a recommendation that all states adopt social media monitoring in order to prevent threats. And then the Florida School Safety Report, a couple weeks after the federal report came out, had very interesting provisions buried on, I think, page 397 or something of the report. It said that threat assessment teams and IEP committees must coordinate information and courses of action regarding exceptional special ed students, I think is the acronym, and that students with IEPs that involve severe behavioral issues, a phrase that was not defined, that is not part of the special ed jargon that exists, should be referred to and evaluated by the threat assessment team. We've seen a variety of other state school safety proposals introduced. Florida has already pre-filed a bill that creates a centralized threat assessment database, a database of anyone, any student who has been assessed as a threat. And it is unclear who would have access to the information collected, how long it would be kept for, and how someone could go about correcting incorrect information. Georgia has a bill that allows the creation of student profiles from school records and records of the Department of Human Services and law enforcement agencies for the purpose of evaluating potential threats to public and private schools. The bill implies that these assessments could be done algorithmically. And then a couple other bills, we're tracking well over 100, so these are just some examples. New York has a bill requiring the installation of school security cameras supported by artificial intelligence. And Maryland would like to add school disciplinary and juvenile record information to their SLDS. So with that framing, as all these states are considering these legislative proposals, we also have districts looking to independently adopt things, and they're receiving pitches from multiple companies in their email inbox. So sort of posing an open question to the panel, what are some of the technologies, new data sharing, new data collection that districts are adopting, that states are pushing districts to adopt? And what are maybe some of the privacy implications of that new data sharing or technology?
Everyone looked my way, so I guess I'll get started. So in Denver Public Schools, we've definitely been looking at a number of things around student safety in addition to just protecting the software vendors that we select. We've been hearing pitches from different vendors around surveillance, like you said, social media, screening processes and things like that. We haven't moved forward on any of that at this time, especially because in the state level, that's not being dictated to us. We're really trying to move slowly so that we don't preemptively do something that we might, need to retract later on. But we actually feel like we have a pretty good ability to monitor given the existing tools that we have in place. We use Gaggle. As well as we have a robust educational technology team that works closely with the schools to monitor what's going on, and we try to kind of do that in the least invasive way possible. So not really in the direction of some of this legislation that you're talking about. We've been really trying to handle a lot of that in-house before we start looking externally to purchase or bring on anybody that might do some of those things for us.
And just for those in the audience who may not know what Gaggle and similar products like that are, would you mind just explaining that quick?
Sure. So Gaggle is a software that allows us to essentially monitor some of the emails that our students might send, filter on certain keywords or things of that nature. So if a student, says bomb or whatever, or I'm going to kill myself, something like that, we're able to look at that on our network, on our traffic without using a third party besides Gaggle to be able to monitor that and then have that conversation with that student, alert their family if needed, that sort of thing, so that we're able to hopefully resolve that issue before something culminates in a tragedy.
Great. So Chad, Michael, what have you guys been seeing?
Well, I think that kind of maybe before we get too deep into the rabbit hole, it's important to kind of put something out there at first, right? Which is, when we talk about what information schools are collecting and how they're surveilling students and that sort of thing, and again, the panel's name is that we're talking about student safety and privacy. And I think it's very important at the outset, I think about what the Hippocratic Oath, first, do no harm. The link between surveilling students and keeping them safe is weak at best. The link between student surveillance and hurting students is strong. And I think it's very important for people to focus in on that. And why do I say that the link is strong? When schools surveil students, and I recently wrote a blog post on this, but I think of the Police song, right? Every move you make, every step you take, every game you play, I'll be watching you. When you do that to students, it violates some of the principles that we hold most dear in this country. It impedes their freedom of speech and communication because students will not speak and communicate freely on many platforms when they know they're being watched. It certainly violates any concepts they have of privacy. It infringes on their freedom of association because one of the things when you watch students the way that you do is you can figure out who they're talking to, what groups they're involved in, what clubs they're involved in, what their social cohorts are. It infringes on their academic freedom. Students may not feel comfortable researching topics that are very private, like LGBT support opportunities, or engage on research on particular political candidates that may not be popular in the areas in which they live. And so there are great harms that come with the decision to surveil students. And yet, on the other hand, there is almost no evidence that surveilling students keeps them safe. So when we have this conversation about what should schools do, what data they have, how do we respect student privacy when we surveil them and collect data, I would have everyone take a step back. And before having the conversation about how we surveil students and yet protect their privacy, I think we need to be engaging in a conversation about whether or not we should be surveilling students at all. And to the extent we're interested in keeping students safe, we should have also an honest conversation about whether in this nation we are honestly exploring all of the methods that can be brought to bear to keep students safe, including, and let the word be said for the first time here, but perhaps not, looking at guns and access to guns. I'm not saying whether that is or is not the right policy prescription, but what I can tell you from someone who has a career in policy development is that when there are major federal restrictions in place around being able to do basic research on the efficacy of gun control measures, and when data that enables you to trace guns used in violent crimes cannot be shared outside of law enforcement contexts, it's very hard to even figure out whether or not that is a viable policy alternative. And so we get forced into conversations about what else can we do. And some of those conversations, in the bullying context, PBIS programs, students struggling with isolation, mental health support are very good. But others, like surveillance, huge pressure is being put on them by politicians who feel the need to act and tech companies who want you to buy their products when there's really no demonstrable evidence that surveillance in any way helps students. But if you want to keep students safe, don't hurt them. First, do no harm.
So I'm going to kind of walk back slightly to a topic that Chad touched on at the beginning of his remarks there. And the connection between surveillance and privacy. And I think it's important to really look at, well, what is privacy? Because privacy is a very broad topic. And if you talk to a number of privacy professionals, you'll get even more definitions of what privacy is. But at its core, privacy is really about is it an unwarranted intrusion into the personal life of the individual? And I think in surveillance, you're collecting information about the individual, you're painting a picture of the individual. We as individuals, we as society accept a certain degree of surveillance all the time. As individuals, we do it with almost every use of technology that we have, every commercial service that we do, our frequent shopper cards, our use of ride-sharing services, like social media, etc. Each one of those collects information about us, and in return we get some value, some service back. And we make those decisions about, is the value we're getting back worth that intrusion into our lives? Is it worth that information being collected and shared about us? I think and bringing this back to school safety, I think where the concern I see in much of the kind of emerging technology and emerging approaches to surveillance is we're talking about collecting a lot more information about students, but we're not having that discussion about, well, exactly what is the value that we're getting back and exactly what are the risks to that collection of information. And unless we're focusing on that value and risk part of it, we can't have an informed discussion about, is it a warranted or an unwarranted intrusion into the individual's privacy?
And just add one point to that, which I think is right. If you want to put a weather app on your phone that full well tracks your location, but you really, really want to know the weather, like, you're right. Like, that's a decision, that's a trade-off that people can make. It's important to point out that school attendance is compulsory. So that's actually not a choice that the kids get to make, or their parents for that matter.
So I want to push back just a little and play devil's advocate with any of you, but particularly Chad, to say, obviously, we're talking about an extremely emotionally laden issue here, where in many ways, and with many of the pitches that people are getting from companies and the pressure people are getting from legislators, it's about saving even one kid. So if we have, anecdotal evidence that maybe a self-harm monitor on a network helps one person, does that outweigh maybe some of the surveillance harms? And I'd love to get more into what those harms are and what is the evidence of that that you were just discussing. So looks like Bryan maybe wants to start.
Yeah, I think, we had a great conversation last night, the four of us, around a number of these topics. And I think, the key, especially that we in Denver Public Schools have really taken here is not racing to jump to some sort of solution or conclusion before we've really evaluated everything that's available and make sure that we're really putting the right thing in place. Because like you said, there's a ton of implications for adopting any sort of surveillance measure, or, purchasing a technology is going to be a cost now incurred by the taxpayers for us as a public education institution. So it's really important that we're evaluating everything and moving slowly, in our opinion, and that's one of the main things that we've really focused on. So I think, there needs to be a balance, certainly, between the two. And Michael, you raised the point of, well, how does one define privacy? I think, Chad, you just added a great point on, well, what's consensual versus what's not. And I think that we just need to move really, really slowly, and I would just caution anyone here that's in that position to be able to make a decision either for the district or, at a policy level, to just not jump to any conclusions on any of this, because it really is a very knee-jerk, like, well, of course we want to help. If this could save one student or one family or whatever, why wouldn't we implement that? Well, what are the longer-term risks or potentially implications of doing something like that?
And I'd add on to that also that the solution is not going to be one size fits all. That what works for Denver may not work for Montclair or Washington, D.C. or Portland or a small town in a rural part of a state. That districts have tremendous diversity, schools have tremendous diversity, and those decisions about what is the appropriate place on that spectrum are very definitely decisions that school administrators, district administrators need to have with their local communities, with the parents, with the students, to find where the appropriate point on that spectrum is.
So I would say, in the first instance, I'm a parent of two young kids in public schools, and so I understand the fear. And when my son was in kindergarten, I stayed briefly late after I dropped him off to talk to the teacher. I can't remember what it was about, but I inadvertently got caught in a soft lockdown drill. And I had to go into the corner of a school with about 25-year-olds huddling in the corner of their classroom, being told, don't make any noise, don't move, with the understanding that someone might be there trying to hurt them. So I understand not only that there is a risk of harm in a gun incident, but I understand that there are massive harms being brought to kids just simply preparing for the possibility of it. So I understand the desire to do something. But do you want to put students under a mass surveillance net in order to prevent harm to one kid? No. I'll share you a little secret. I know how to prevent anyone in this country from ever being the victim of violent crime ever again. You want to know the answer? Put everyone in jail. Now, that would work, but the implications of the solution are worse than the problem. And there is no evidence that surveillance, I understand the desire to do something. And sometimes you'll go to something like surveillance to feel like you're doing something. But if the something doesn't help and the something hurts, you cannot take solace in having done something, because you, in fact, are then hurting the children. And don't resist the urge to hurt children while you're figuring out how to help them. And I think that in the rush to surveillance and to spying on kids, we are hurting our kids while we're trying to figure out how to help them.
So I want to let the audience know, by the way, that we are taking questions via Slido. So if you want to go either through the app or slido.com, South by Southwest EDU is the code, and I believe we're in room 12AB. So happy to take questions through that. So to take a step back and talk about sort of legally, what are some of the questions here? Michael, your office just recently put out some guidance on the federal student privacy law, FERPA, and how it interacts with school safety situations. Can you talk a little bit about the major takeaways from that?
Sure, absolutely. Amelia mentioned the Federal Commission on School Safety's report that came out last fall, and one of the issues that came up a number of times during the meetings that the commission had and the statements that experts from around the country brought up was there's this substantial perception that FERPA, which is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, is an impediment to the proper sharing of information to prevent health or safety emergencies or to prevent school safety initiatives more broadly. And what the reality is that there are a number of provisions under FERPA that permit the appropriate sharing of students' personally identifiable information to support school safety initiatives. But the awareness of those provisions is lacking in many places. So the guidance that we issued just a month or so ago, I guess now, really walked through, well, what are FERPA's requirements for protecting student privacy? And then walked through, I think it was 37 frequently asked questions about how that applies in various school safety contexts. And the key provisions here to be aware of are schools are permitted to disclose student information to school officials that have a legitimate educational interest in the information. And those school officials can include third parties who are not school employees per se, but that are operating within the school and providing a service that the school would otherwise do themselves. And kind of the key here would be like school resource officers, for example. You can share student information with school resource officers if they have a legitimate educational interest, provided certain conditions are met. Beyond that, there are also provisions for disclosure of student information to any appropriate party in connection with an actual or impending health or safety emergency. So if there is an incident that is ongoing, or if you have credible evidence that there's a significant and articulable threat that a student or someone else may do harm to themselves or others in the school community, you can share that information with any appropriate party that's in a position to be able to respond or address that threat. And so there are a number of these provisions in FERPA that permit the appropriate sharing of information. Our guidance that we issued last month really kind of puts that all into one place to help raise awareness of exactly what are the rules, but then also what are the provisions that schools can make use of to improve school safety.
So there's one thing in the FERPA section of that report that troubles me greatly, which is the conclusion, and I'm not saying the conclusion is wrong, incidentally, that if the information is collected by the school in a law enforcement capacity, so if you have a school resource officer is viewing videos or something like that, that doesn't qualify as a school record because that is in fact something more akin to a law enforcement record. That may be true. Don't use that. Don't have cops in your schools. Your children are students, they're not prospective criminals. Do not break down your school in any way where you have anyone in your school helping you with your children who is outside of the scope of being a school official. Kids are not going to a simultaneous school and jail in the morning unless you make it that. So I think that may or may not be an accurate conclusion. I'm not a FERPA expert, but I would, to the extent that people have school systems, do not attempt to delineate between a majority of the people in your school who are educators and some people who are law enforcement. I think that creates a really horrible climate for students who are trying to learn. The last thing we need to do is to make the school to prison pipeline even worse, and we need to be honest about this too. It's not white wealthy kids who are at risk when they go to their school of ending up in the school to prison pipeline. It's the same population that we have over incarcerated for decades, if not centuries, in this country. So I would caution people, don't set it up that way. It does not create a positive environment in your school.
So I want to go ahead and shift to some of the audience comments on Slido because I think they're really useful to dig in further on some of these concepts. So first of all, really concretely, what are some examples of surveillance harms? What has research shown? And with the technologies such as facial recognition, visitor management systems, network monitoring, self-harm monitoring, what are the concrete harms that could come from those things?
How long is a panel? I mean, there's I can give very specific harms, right? Facial recognition software is largely inaccurate when it comes to older faces and younger faces and female faces and the faces of persons of color. So you're going to get a lot of false positives. And as a matter of fact, the ACLU tested out the technology by running some criminal facial databases against members of Congress, and incorrectly found that quite a few members of Congress were popping up as having had, felony records, almost all of which were members of color, and so there are inherent problems within the technology in and of itself. But more largely speaking, schools are supposed to be places of freedom, of academic freedom, of speech freedom, of association freedom, one analogy that's given that is not my own, but I borrow it, is what surveillance feels like to a person, to a student, to anyone. And the analogy is that imagine you are in your car and you're driving down the highway, and you look in your rearview mirror and you notice there's a police car driving behind you. How do you respond to that, right? 2 hands on the wheel. You check your speed limit. You're signaling every single time you change a lane, and you drive along, and then when that cop car pulls out beside you and goes on, you're like, oh. That's what surveillance feels like. How do students learn in school when they feel like they're being watched all the time? Or do they take measures to avoid the risk? Do they get off of social media? Do they stop sending emails and texts to their friends? Do they stop going to clubs or meetings that they might be afraid about being associated with? So those are the broader risks of the technology, is that they create students who are either at risk for being who they are, or students who have to change who they are so they are no longer at risk. And I can't imagine that that's the sort of school system that we want to foster in this country.
So I can add a little bit to that from our lens. Chad's touched a lot on what it would feel like for the student, what some of those risks are. But a real simple one that we look at would be, what is the perception within the community? And how do parents and families feel about things that are going on? Because that relationship is really essential to us. Especially in Denver, we have a lot of students who their families have immigrated to the United States. They want to make sure that that information, is private, and surveillance and things like that, especially when you're talking about the introduction of law enforcement into databases like our student information system or things of that nature, could be essentially a humongous risk for those families. So when we're talking about surveillance harms, one thing that we really look at is how can we ensure that we're protecting our community, not just while they're in school, which is certainly what you're talking about, but also just in general, and strengthening that community and ensuring that there is trust in the schools and the school district to safeguard the best interests of that family in general.
And I want to add, I think there's 2 different kinds of surveillance that we're talking about here. I think there's a big difference between human surveillance, where you've got actual individuals that are reviewing the information that's being collected and making decisions themselves, and surveillance that is being performed by AI, predictive analytics, algorithmic engines, etc. I think in the latter case, when you're talking about predictive analytics, when you're talking about these automated early warning systems, there certainly can be tremendous potential there, but there's also a lot of risk baked in because many of those algorithms are black boxes. You don't know what factors are necessarily driving conclusions. They're, by their very nature, probabilistic. They're generating probabilities that a certain activity might occur, or that a certain behavior may result. And we, as consumers of these predictions, tend not to look under the hood, so to speak. We tend not to look as much at what is driving the prediction, and we tend to over-rely on the prediction itself. We don't think of it as a probability, we think of it as oh, this has identified this student as a red flag. They have a red flag now. And I think if we are going to rely on these technologies, if we are going to start implementing them, there has to be a major initiative to educate the consumers of these engines, educate the consumers of these tools in their limitations, and also kind of give them mechanisms that they can use to ensure that there is not bias being baked in to the recommendations, that this is not perpetuating biases that may already exist in the data or making them worse.
So this is a perfect lead in to an audience question. So we've talked about some of the things to avoid rushing to. What does work and what should we be doing instead, with the understanding that there are going to be communities that, for capacity reasons or others, will need to use tech in order to assist with their school safety measures?
So I'm happy to jump in on this one. I think that, you know, the key, and I sort of already alluded to it as well, is just engagement with the community. I mean, Michael, you had said previously that every school district is going to go about it in a different way, and that's absolutely true, especially in the state of Colorado. I mean, we have our district, Denver Public Schools, is the largest in the state at just over 90,000 students, but we have some rural districts, you know, with a student population of 300 or 400, where, you know, whereas I'm privileged to be a part of a large IT department, their IT department who's handling a lot of these questions might be a team of one, where that person's doing everything from serving as the CTO of the organization all the way down to fixing hardware that comes in broken, you know, from students and teachers. So I think it's very, very important to be willing to have that conversation, to understand that it's going to look different for every district of every different size. And then really to listen, right? To say, okay, families, what are you concerned about? Some families and parents and things of that nature are going to have concerns they already have. They're going to have things that they already want to see done. Maybe in some cases they've already done the research. A lot of the best conversations that I've had in my role as student data privacy officer with our families come from parents who might work in tech already, and they're saying, well, hey, listen, have you heard of this, or have you considered this standard when you're doing an integration of data or something like that? And we end up learning a ton from them when we're willing to engage in that dialogue. I think that sometimes there's this adversarial relationship, it seems, between, you know, school districts and communities. At least it gets cast that way in the media, and I think anything you can do to dismantle that would be a strong starting point in terms of having that conversation, listening to the responses, and then taking those action items and saying, okay, these are the things that are important. Let's compare that to the things that we've researched, that we're looking at doing, and figure out what we can adopt.
So I would say that a couple of things. One, we are becoming a very tech-dependent society. Let's not assume reflexively that tech is going to provide us with the answer to this problem. The Department of Ed, and really I should say the School Safety Commission's study on this issue, which has a lot of flaws that I'm happy to talk about, but it does point out several very strong non-technology dependent programs, you know, everything from PBIS, which is an anti-bullying and kind of respect for all social emotional learning program that's highly effective, the availability of more mental health services to students. There are a lot of programs in there that aren't necessarily tech dependent. Now, one of the things we were talking about last night is the problem with some of those programs is private industry can't make a lot of money off of them. So private tech is going to come to you pushing solutions for you to buy for hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars, and they're going to have the marketing resources to push those on you. But let's not assume that tech is necessarily the place to go. Let's not assume it's not either, which leads me to my second point. In the School Safety Commission's report, before it was even rolled out, Secretary DeVos said that there would be absolutely no exploration into guns and gun controls as part of that examination. Now, she and her commission, and I say her commission because she's the chair of it, have backed off that a little bit. And they did in their report, and it's 177 pages. I read the whole thing. It's kind of worth reading because there's some good stuff in there. Explored one possible gun control measure, which was raising the age to purchase firearms. That's the only one they explored. Nothing about assault weapons bans or anything like that, just raising the age. And they concluded that the research did not support that raising the age would have beneficial effects. And so the report just moved on. What it didn't mention is part of the reason that research is lacking is because it's banned by the federal government. And oddly enough, the report then recommended what to do in the areas more research. Another thing that the report also noted was that there is not much evidence that surveillance actually helps with the issue. So, in the big picture, as to what helps. We can identify some things, but I think that what we need to recognize is that we need to do more exploration to what helps. We're really, we've been looking for a long time, but we're still at the very beginnings of what I think has to be a deep exploration into what we can do to solve some serious problems. And the only thing that I ask is that exploration be an honest one. Every possible solution should be aired, should be researched, examined. Let's do it with everything. The ACLU is not a big fan of student surveillance, but absolutely put that on the table. Research it, talk about it, investigate it. Let's find out, everything that can be done. But we need to. Let's not assume that tech is our solution or that every solution that we should be considering is out there right now. We have a long way to go.
So this leads well into another audience question. We keep talking about surveillance as harmful in general terms, but not all technologies are equal. Are any surveillance technologies good? One thing I'll say from a panel I attended on Monday, this isn't specifically a surveillance technology, is the leader of the Sandy Hook Promise organization, they've created and taken research and actually put together an anonymous reporting app. And we've actually seen that be introduced in several states, and I think it both helps because it's protecting students' privacy. Like if someone's abusing it, they can get a subpoena and break and find out who specifically submitted something, but generally speaking, it is entirely anonymous and allows for finding out about these things without having to necessarily do more invasive surveillance. But from all of you, what do you think, what surveillance technologies may be useful? What have we seen work? And how do you put appropriate privacy guardrails around certain technologies that may be adopted, like social media monitoring, like network monitoring, like Gaggle, GoGuardian, Lightspeed, to make sure that privacy is protected while those systems are being used? Not to throw multiple questions at all of you.
I mean, just definitionally on surveillance, I'm talking about government surveillance. I would not put, the kind of if you see something, say something reporting into the surveillance bucket, because that's not kind of a mass surveillance. That's if people who are engaged in social conversations with individuals see something disturbing and they decide to highlight it to others, the fact that if you learn something by virtue of a conversation with someone as opposed to reading about it on a social media post doesn't make one surveillance and one not. So I wouldn't really call that surveillance. I would just call that individual reporting. Although I would say that the School Safety Commission does make a good point about anonymous reporting can be problematic. It can be turned into a tool of bullying. But that being said, again, with any policy benefits, drawbacks, I think probably there, the benefits of encouraging people to report if they see something and maybe a problem probably outweigh its drawbacks.
I think I'll jump in a little bit there and say, we try to remain largely tool agnostic, quite honestly, as the Department of Technology for our larger district, and we really want to support our schools and our departments in selecting things that work for them, regardless of what is selected. However, we want to make sure that that safeguarding piece is in place, and so we have, at least on our side, adopted very robust contracting processes and have a large data sharing agreement that we enter into with every vendor, things like that. However, when it comes to surveillance, I would just say, make sure that you're looking at how that data is going to be used long term. Make sure that you've got the protections in place so that, if they're sharing it with a third party now, that sort of thing is documented and captured. There's always within educational technology the risk that a vendor you work with might be sharing or selling that data on the side or whatever nefarious purpose they might have. And I think that that's especially true when we're talking about a sensitive category like surveillance. If people are recording voice, or I saw one of the questions was around biometrics, if those types of things are coming in, that's escalating that type of PII now. We're not just talking about demographic information. These things they could be used to identify that student long into their life. And so just make sure that as the district, if you're in that role, that you're truly safeguarding that, serving as the gatekeeper, and not allowing something in that you have questions about, like we had said earlier, the knee-jerk reaction. Make sure that you're screening folks. Make sure that if they have changes in their policy, that you're keeping up on that. A lot of the state laws now are requiring that, at least in Colorado. If a vendor were to change their policy, for example, in our data sharing agreement, they must let us know. So if at one point they were operating with integrity and they get bought out, something changes, they have to let us know, that sort of thing. So just make sure that you've got all of that in writing up front so that you really can leverage that if there ever does turn out to be an instance where that data was used for the wrong reasons.
So you took my point from me here. I was going to bring up a lot of that, but echoing that. So I think it is important to realize that if you are going to be collecting new information, potentially sensitive information as part of a surveillance tool or technology, there are going to be legal requirements that have to be met. It will probably, with some exceptions, it will probably be protected under FERPA. Any contractual arrangements you have with third parties who are doing this for you will need to meet the requirements under FERPA for safeguarding the information. But I think it's also important to realize that even beyond the legal requirements for protecting the information, there are a number of best practices that you should also consider. First amongst those is how long are you going to be keeping it? I think if you're collecting this information for a very kind of short-term purpose to feed into an early warning system, for example, then odds are you shouldn't be holding on to that information for 5 or 10 years or having kind of an indefinite record retention on it. The longer you hold on to information, the more it is following a student throughout their academic career, the more it persists in vendor databases to fuel further algorithmic decision making, the greater the likelihood that there might be a data breach that could harm the student, the greater the likelihood that it might unfairly influence the student's academic efforts later on. I think there's a real need to consider just how long to hold on to this and then to get rid of that information when it's no longer needed for the purpose for which it was collected.
Yeah, and this is a really valuable conversation because I think it highlights that they are different harm points, right? So there is absolutely a harm point, and we'll go kind of in reverse chronological order. There are risks for harm points at the sharing stage. Who do we share this information with? And you can certainly create harm risks in who you share with. There is absolutely a harm risk at the data retention stage. If we're collecting this data, are we keeping it for a period of days or months or years? There is a risk point at the collection stage. The mere fact that you are collecting data may deter students from engaging in behaviors like using social media that can be helpful to them. And there's a risk point at the monitoring stage. What exactly are schools monitoring? I've heard stories of school districts monitoring for the use of the hashtag Black Lives Matter. That has a big problem. And so I think that they are kind of risks throughout the process, and it's very important to be cognizant of the fact that there are potential harms that can be borne out at a variety of stages. So it's really helpful to look at those varying in different stages.
So we're bringing up students now, which leads us perfectly into another question that I wanted to make sure we talk about, which is, should students be involved in these conversations about how to handle their safety and privacy? And if so, how can they join the conversation?
So I'll start with that one. As I mentioned before, a lot of the discussions and decisions that need to be made about what is the right thing to do, particularly with surveillance, with technology use, et cetera, are decisions that have to be made at the local level, whether that's the state level or the district level or the school level. And those have to be informed by the communities in which the decisions are being made. I think central to that is transparency. One of the fundamental privacy principles kind of that guides all of our privacy laws and our frameworks for considering privacy is the idea that no information collection should ever be a secret. There should not be any technology that a school is using that is collecting information that parents and students are unaware is being collected, or using it for purpose that parents and students are not aware that is being used. So central to this concept of privacy rights or privacy ethics is this idea that you should know what is being collected about you and how it is being used.
Just to push back really quickly, because I'm sure this is in the mind of many, as I've had privacy conversations outside of this, why is that transparency important? What happens in the absence of that transparency? And doesn't being transparent about all of this allow people to game the system?
So there's two questions there.
Michael doesn't have to necessarily be the one to answer.
I think, okay, why is the transparency critical? I think absolutely because schools have a responsibility to protect the safety of students. That includes their physical safety, their online safety, et cetera. And they are acting in place of the parents when they're doing that. And so consequently, schools are making decisions that influence the students. And schools and districts and states and the federal government, we are accountable to the communities that we serve. We're accountable to our constituents. So if schools are making decisions that influence the privacy of students, they're doing so in a manner that has to be accountable to the very parents that they are acting for. And so I think if you are engaging in data collection or data use in the shadows, then you're avoiding that accountability piece. And I've talked with a number of district leaders and state leaders who, when I recommend being more transparent about what data is being collected outside of the school safety context, where we're talking about educational apps, for example, they're like, oh, well, if we put the full list of the information we're collecting, parents would really push back on us. I'm like, and they probably should. Because if you can't justify why you are collecting something, if you can't give a coherent reason for why you are collecting a piece of information about a student and the value that that is providing to their educational experience or their educational outcomes, if you can't give that coherent explanation, then you probably shouldn't be collecting it in the first place. And so hiding behind that veil of secrecy because you don't want to have angry parents coming to your door is really shirking your responsibilities. Because you really should be front and center, fully transparent, even radically transparent about what you're doing, and having those debates about, is this appropriate information to collect? Is this an appropriate use of the information? Is this an appropriate way to share the data? Whether or not it's legal, you should be having those, is it appropriate? And the only way you can do that is by being transparent and having that communications channel.
I mean, I would say just in short, because of its impact on civil rights and civil liberties, no surveillance program should ever be implemented without the knowledge and consent of the population that is going to be surveilled. Full stop.
Echo both statements so far, absolutely, and I appreciate your perspective, Michael, around how to maintain that accountability as a district, and right, like, well, if our parents wouldn't really want to know, if they found out they wouldn't want us to be collecting that, maybe we shouldn't be. I mean, that's a really wonderful conversation, and one we certainly try to have both internally and with our families as often as possible to ensure we're doing that. In Denver Public Schools, we're a decentralized model, so our schools have a ton of autonomy. They can make a lot of the decisions for what ed tech or various other things they might bring into the classroom. And so those conversations become even more essential than when it all filters down through an IT department or whatever at the central office. So I do want to, on that note, you asked another piece, Amelia, around what about gaming the system? And I would say two things. One, I mean, that is the price of admission, and I think it's well worth it. If there's people that are going to now take advantage of some new rule or loophole or something that comes about as a result of being transparent, so be it. We'll deal with that as needed. The other thing is, if you're figuring out how to game the system, maybe we should extend that olive branch and have that conversation there as well. So, okay, student, you just figured out how to manipulate the HTML in our SIS system to log in as your teacher and change your grades. Come have a conversation with us about how you did that. Maybe we can bring you on as an intern because you clearly have some skills, right? So I think there's an opportunity there to also say, if these loopholes or challenges exist, they're a product of the system we created, how do we patch them, and how do we include more voices in that discussion to ensure that whatever it is, the process, the program, the product is better long term.
So there's a question I really, really like that we got from the audience, which is, what are all of your thoughts on administrations or schools' ability to interpret and use surveillance data fairly? How are they trained, or I think more accurately, how should they be trained, since most districts are only just beginning to deal with the privacy implications here, to interpret and respond to the data?
So I'll speak again on that. The double edge of the sword that I just mentioned around being really decentralized is that we have a huge volume of things coming into the district as a result. And so training really becomes incumbent upon our school site leaders to make sure that that's occurring, because we essentially aren't able necessarily to provide all of the training and resources that we would like to be able to do so. And so I think that in our instance, in our case in Denver Public Schools, were certain surveillance technologies or options to be adopted, we would really want to manage essentially the change management piece of that using some of the business vernacular here, and ensure that we had a really strong communication and training plan before anything was implemented, because a lot of that stuff can be really hard to kind of take back after it's already gone out. People start doing it their way, whatever it is, now they're resistant. So really making sure that that conversation is happening up front, like, hey, if this is what we're going to do, these are the steps that we're going to have for implementation, for reporting. It's going to be consistent so that for a student, we have high mobility in Denver Public Schools, so that a student, if they're switching schools mid-year or whatnot, they can go from one building to another and expect the same experience, that sort of thing. I think it just becomes really important to standardize something like that, whereas it makes a lot of sense with ed tech to have autonomy, ensure that schools and teachers can do what they want. I think when we're talking about something like this that has so much larger implications, to Chad's point, we just really want to be thoughtful about that implementation.
So I would add on that. So I mentioned earlier that in these situations, there's not a one-size-fits-all solution, that there's tremendous diversity in schools and districts across the country. But at the same time, schools don't exist in a vacuum. Districts don't exist in a vacuum. And many of the challenges that they face on how to properly implement surveillance or to use it appropriately, how to adopt privacy programs and practices more generally, these are challenges that many other schools and districts have already faced. And for years, I've been mentioning that there are a lot of districts out there that are struggling to implement a privacy program more broadly because they don't have the resources for it and they don't have the expertise, and they think if they are going to implement a privacy program, it's going to be expensive and time-consuming. And the first thing I tell them is go find your peer districts, those who are better resourced or those who have gone through this already, and piggyback on the work that they have done. Don't reinvent the wheel. Find those districts that have had lessons learned, either positive ones or negative ones. Learn what didn't work. Learn what did. Adopt their policies, either whole cloth or with minor revisions to suit your particular district's needs. There are a lot of districts out there that have done work on this already. capitalize on the work that they have done and leverage it for your own use. And they're usually more than happy to share it.
Absolutely. And I'll say my organization has also started creating some school safety resources, and we'll be continuing to, and I actually have some of them with us if anyone wants to take those, including what are some of the privacy protections and the associated questions you might want to ask once you've adopted a particular technology, as you're thinking about adopting a particular technology, including questions like, have you talked with the community? Have you made sure this is the most effective thing to solve the school safety issue that you want to solve? So going back to questions as we run out of time, we have a comment/question, which is, would love to know more about the hard evidence supporting Mr. Marlow's claim that current surveillance methods are doing massive harms to students. Before I pass it over to Chad, there's a couple things I'd love to point people towards, just because I think they're examples of some of the amazing journalism that's occurring when it comes to this issue and the difficult ethical questions that come up. One is a story by Bethany Barnes in the Oregonian, came out, I believe, last year in May or June, and it actually follows a family of a child who's being threat assessed by the school, and that child happens to have autism, which feeds into a lot of the concerns around threatening behaviors. And really, I would say doesn't necessarily come to a conclusion about whether the school necessarily didn't do things right, whether the family should have done something more, but really examines those issues and cannot recommend it enough. You also had a recent ProPublica New York Times joint investigation about a student that was, because of, I believe, either the shoes, I think it was the shoes he was wearing, he was identified as potentially being part of a gang, ended up with the school attempting to deport him. So we've seen some things there, but highly recommend you read both of those because I think they're extremely useful. Chad, what do you have to sort of add to all that?
So first, thank you for raising those. Those are both amazing sources. So what I would say is I would have people look, and first of all, talk to kids. If you want to know how it's impacting them, I can tell you, but there was a girl who was in high school I talked to in Florida who posted a picture of a food fight in the cafeteria on her Facebook page. The school saw it, they suspended her, she stopped using Facebook. And that happens all over the country. But I'd zoom out larger. Like, don't ask the question so narrowly. Ask yourself, what is the harm of surveillance, right? It has the same impact on students as it has on people. And so if you want to know, what the harm of surveillance is, talk to members of Black Lives Matter who are surveilled enormously and the impact that it has on their work. Talk to people who are involved in the civil rights movement and the Black Panthers, and they will tell you. Talk to someone from East Germany during communism, and they will tell you. Surveillance crushes freedom, surveillance crushes liberty. And there are more documentary evidence on that than most subjects that we can find in this country. I'm reminded of the fact that people think about surveillance being linked to technology, but it's certainly not. The earliest surveillance law that I'm aware of in the United States was in place in New York City before the Revolutionary War. And what it was called, they were called lamplight laws. And what lamplight laws said is if you live in New York City and you're Black and you're going out after dark, you have to carry a lamplight with you. Why? So people can see you and see what race you are. That's what oppressive surveillance looks like. So the idea that somehow surveilling students might have a different impact on them than it has had on any other group through human history, to me, I would say, not to be flippant, but you show me evidence that's not hurting the students, because really all evidence otherwise suggests that surveillance has a very negative impact on the sense of individuality and freedom and liberty of those people who are being surveilled.
And from a scientific perspective, it's been well documented that observing someone changes their behavior. The Hawthorne effect is well documented in sociology and statistics. So the mere act of observing somebody is going to change their behavior. Whether or not it's going to change it for the worse is perhaps a valid question. I think Chad made some excellent arguments for why it might change it for the worse. But even if we're agnostic on whether it's going to be changing their behavior for better or for worse, we should know how it's going to change their behavior before we adopt it.
And I just want to add more thing. I did see one question that was up that we didn't get to, but it's important enough that I do want to get to it. And someone said, you know, I don't understand the argument that surveillance like programs like Gaggle aren't helpful. You know, I know that it stops student suicides. I know that it stops student shooting. So the first thing I would say is, how do you know that? You know, how do you know that a student was absolutely going to kill themselves or absolutely going to engage in a shooting? But more importantly than that is, I think, because I would say this, I feel fairly confident that all educators who are proponents of student surveillance are coming from a good place. I don't think anyone wants to surveil students because they want to clamp down on student freedom and liberty. I think it comes from a good place. But I often think about, and it really gets in my mind, about the situation of a student who may potentially be considering suicide, right? They may decide to post something on social media because they want to get some support from their peers. And that may be the thing that helps them. If a school sees that and intervenes, we see you. We know you're depressed. We know you're contemplating suicide. I'm not certain that might not be the thing that drives the student to self-harm. So I think we need to be very, very careful in our exuberance to help students that we don't hurt them. And I feel like that's the theme we keep coming back to here. And as time's running out, maybe it's not the worst thing to highlight one more time. In our incredibly appropriate and wonderful desire to help students, let us not hurt them in the process. And I think that in all of this conversation about how do we balance student safety and student privacy, maybe we need to decouple that. Maybe we need to say there is no link, nor should there be a link between keeping students safe and violating their privacy. And in fact, that if we want to keep students safe, we have to explore all sorts of measures to accomplish that. But one of the ways to keep students safe is by protecting their privacy.
All right, I think that is a good note to end on. I think we can all stick around at least for a few minutes if you have additional questions. I really want to thank all of you for coming today and engaging on this topic. I know we are all eager to always talk more about this. As I said, there are some resources that I'm happy to share if you want to come and take one. And thank you again for being here.